As the U.S. redeploys its combat troops from Iraq,
Goodbye, Iraq. We will remove all our troops from Iraq by the end of 2011.
Going home!
If it looks like an occupation, and it sounds like an occupation, then it's an occupation.
America's other war in Afghanistan intensifies. The death toll rises. There is no end in sight.
The United States is not running for the exit.
We are not leaving Afghanistan.
Leaving carnage and political paralysis in its wake. Will the Americans really pull out of the Middle East?
The United States of America does not quit.
This is Empire. Hello and welcome to Empire. For some, America's invasion and occupation of Iraq and Afghanistan that aim to solidify its global leadership have instead eroded its superpower status. Others hope the election of Barack Obama would slow down its decay and restore its credibility around the world. But 2 years later, there are no breakthroughs as the US licks its wounds, counts its losses, intensifies its secret wars, and contemplates its next moves in the Muslim world. Before we tackle the meaning of US combat troops withdrawal from Iraq and the seriousness of its commitment for total withdrawal next year, we'll begin our discussion about the ramifications of the latest military escalation and deterioration in Afghanistan with my guests. Christopher Dickey, author and Middle East editor for Newsweek magazine. Colonel Richard KEMP, former commander of the British forces in Afghanistan. Alan Gresh, author and deputy editor of Le Monde Diplomatique. And last but not least, Seamus Milne, editor and columnist at The Guardian newspaper. But first, filmmaker Rick Crowley takes a close look at the US military campaign in Marja that was presented as a prototype for future counterinsurgency operations to win the war against the Taliban.
This mission is a historic mission. We are really at a tipping point in the future of the campaign.
When President Obama bought into the McChrystal plan, McChrystal chose Marja as the place where he was going to demonstrate that U.S. counterinsurgency doctrine could be applied successfully in this war. It was his demonstration case, his test case. It took on enormous importance. Now McChrystal's gone. Marja, therefore, is a burden for Petraeus, because Marja hangs out there, calling into question the feasibility of counterinsurgency in Afghanistan.
Marja, Helmand Province, Afghanistan. The point of impact for President Obama's troop surge, the showcase of America's new counterinsurgency campaign, the turning point in the war. The offensive here was supposed to demonstrate to Afghans and to the world that victory is still possible in Afghanistan.
We've accomplished, providing a secure environment, depending on your definition of security, establishing a government, rebuilding roads and schools, opening up bazaars. There's a lot of naysaying. That's fine. I recommend that naysayers come and see it for themselves.
Out on patrol with LIMA Company, it is difficult to see the success that Colonel Christmas describes.
Enemy activities picked up considerably. A lot of ambushes coming from multiple points. We call L-shaped ambushes, or ambushes with small arms is coming at you from more than one direction. But the big change has just been the improvement of the enemy that we're facing. Much better fighters than we were facing at the beginning, I think.
It's not getting easier for you.
Easier? No, it's not getting any easier.
Marines here say that the insurgency they face is growing stronger and more sophisticated. We march over fields and wade through canals to avoid the homemade bombs that line the roads and footpaths. The Marines have carved small circles of relative security around their forward operating bases, but when they step outside these circles, they almost invariably come under fire. Militarily, Marja has not gone according to plan. But far more important than the military fight, according to the Americans, is the political struggle to build a credible government that Afghans will prefer to Taliban rule. Lieutenant Colonel Christmas says his main mission is to build up the local government, and he organizes many events like this one, where the district governor and officials from Kabul are flown in to preside over meetings of Marja residents. Today's meeting is a reintegration shura, where prisoners are released and symbolically turn in their rifles, pledging loyalty to the government. Before the offensive began, commanders announced that a complete civil administration had been assembled to bring order, stability, and development as soon as the Marines were in place. General McChrystal called it a government in a box and said it was the key to the entire campaign. But most of the bureaucrats and government officials refused to deploy to Marja. One man who did come was NATO's hand-picked district governor, Haji Zaire, an Afghan expat who spent 4 years in a German prison for attempted murder.
I'm not sure that I really know what McChrystal meant by government in a box. I'm not sure that McChrystal knew what he meant by government in a box.
I think that was a pipe dream. It's a neat idea, but frankly, what happened was that Haji Zaire was brought, and he was put in the middle, and it said, okay, go. And that's a tough thing to do.
I thank Marine has helped me every day.
In spite of Lieutenant Colonel Christmas's best efforts, Haji Zaire's administration failed to inspire confidence, and the Afghan government fired him unceremoniously.
The best McChrystal could do was an ex-con from Germany, the pool of talent from which we can draw in this nation-building enterprise. It's pretty darn thin.
I influence them, but I'm not in control of them, nor will I ever be in control of them, and that's fine. If they want it, it'll happen. If they don't want it, it won't happen, right?
Out on patrol with LIMA Company, it would be easy to conclude that Afghans don't want the government that NATO and the US are trying to build for them. This morning, a small homemade bomb was used to lure the Marines into a trap. Residents here refused to give any information, and it was only when a Marine spotted this kite string trigger that we managed to avoid this deadlier device, 50 pounds of explosive packed with shrapnel. As Lieutenant QUIST's men destroy the bomb, we can hear heavy machine gun and mortar fire in the distance.
2nd platoon is down there, dropping mortars, and we had 3rd platoon in contact to the west.
So 3 different elements of LIMA all sustain contact of some sort today?
Yep.
It's busy out here.
It is busy. It is busy.
The U.S. committed thousands of troops and millions of dollars to secure this small farming area in order to demonstrate to the world that victory was still possible in Afghanistan. But Marja has revealed a counterinsurgency campaign in crisis. The U.S. faces enemies that are more resilient than they anticipated and lacks political allies capable of building a credible state.
I have serious doubts about our capacity to transform Afghanistan into a functioning nation state where authority is effectively exercised from Kabul. It's a monumental task.
Colonel KEMP, things are getting bad. You're not going to be able to transform Afghanistan. Why not withdraw before they get worse?
Well, I wouldn't agree you can't transform Afghanistan. I think what we saw there in Marja obviously is not a resounding success, but I remember when Operation Moshtarak, of which Marja was part, was launched. At that time, General McChrystal said it would be taking probably until the end of the year to make significant progress in Marja or anywhere else.
But it's getting actually worse now as we speak.
It is getting worse, but we're also seeing beginning to see the effects in parts of southern Afghanistan of the US troop build-up. Remember, we haven't actually even finally reached the culminating point of the surge, and it will take a while before when that surge reaches its culminating point before it starts to bite. It could take another 6 months, a year before we see real progress.
For every time I heard that over the last 10 years, I would have probably become a millionaire. But
we
things are getting worse.
But we haven't yet seen this level of forces in Afghanistan. You're particularly in the Helmand area and the southern part of Afghanistan, Kandahar. These are horrendous areas that have been heavily underinvested with military forces up until now. Now, whether there's enough there now to deal with the problem is another question, but certainly there's at least a chance, I think, with a significant increase in troops of hitting the insurgency and pushing the insurgency back. There are 2 other really important things. One is getting good governance, which doesn't exist and of which there is frankly no sign at present. And secondly is denying the Taliban of their safe havens, particularly across the border in Pakistan.
But Chris, it's actually getting worse. Afghanistan used to be 117 on the list of most corrupted, now it's 172. The government there is accused by its own ally, the United States, as being one of the most corrupt. nation building is not exactly getting anywhere?
Well, look, a big part of the problem is that the kind of model that we're trying to apply in Afghanistan is a model that we understand, a model of a strong central government with a strong army that holds everything together. There are a lot of dangers in that. The most obvious one is that if you do keep pushing for a strong central government and it doesn't work, then somebody can take over that government, somebody who doesn't like you, like the Taliban, and then they have the whole country, as they once did. So there's a lot of discussion now about the possibility of decentralizing or re-decentralizing the strategy in Afghanistan, where you have the Pashtun areas being more or less autonomous, and you start to have the urban areas, which are places that we at least think we understand and where the policies of the United States have been relatively successful. You have them better protected, but you don't use huge resources trying to conquer rural areas. Marja, one of the things about Marja is it's very decentralized. There's no urban place in Marja. It's a bunch of scattered little villages. You go into that kind of environment, and sure, you'll be prey to booby traps, snipers, every kind of guerrilla tactic very successfully, and there's no cohesiveness there to keep things together.
Seamus, America is accused of wanting more and more to decentralize and atomize and divide the region and its states into places like similar to what it done in Iraq. You think it will still be able to transform Afghanistan on that model?
Well, obviously they're looking at different options given the evident failure of what's taken place and what is taking place at the moment in terms of the occupation. But I think there are a lot of good reasons to think that the kind of thing that was done in Iraq, and which is anyway breaking down in Iraq at the time of the surge, particularly the building up of the awakening councils, the splitting of the Sunni resistance and so on, cannot happen in Afghanistan, partly because the Pashtuns are by far the largest ethnic group in the population, and there are not the same sectarian divisions in the country. But also, I think it's clear from a military point of view that the number of troops that the Americans are putting into Afghanistan cannot possibly pacify the country. And
it's not like the Iraqi model is a great model to follow anyway.
From the American point of view, the American casualties were reduced and the overall level of violence reduced after the sectarian war of 2006-07. But of course, that's now falling apart. The mechanisms that were used to do that are eroding and disintegrating.
But the sectarian war wasn't really innocent. I mean, a lot of us were speaking about the El Salvador option, that these death squads were trained in the Interior Ministry, and America, you know, was indirectly implicit
there's
in all
no
of
question
this.
that the United States played the sectarian card in Iraq from the very beginning of the occupation.
And it did that in Afghanistan
and that has
back
been
in the 80s.
The single most important factor in limiting the defeat, the strategic defeat the United States has endured in Iraq.
But this might sound like a cliche, Alain, but how many Afghans do have to die until Britain and the United States get their game in place? I mean, it's been decades now. The British tried a century ago, the Russians tried 3 decades ago.
And there is a memory in the Afghan people. They know that they have always been invaders and they never stay. So when you are in a village or you are in part of Afghan, you know that even if you have very strong American troops, you know that there will be 1 year, 2 years, they will leave. And you will have to solve the problem with the people who are on the ground, which means the Taliban or other forces. So I don't think it can work in any case, especially when the American government says that after 1 year they are going to leave.
I agree with Seamus here also that the American forces and British forces in Afghanistan are not going to control, not going to solve the problem. They're not going to deal with the Taliban themselves, and that's why the Afghan military is in many respects the key to the military aspects of this campaign. And it's only if we're able to leave in place a strong Afghan military.
Do you actually think Afghanistan can afford 500,000 soldiers in the long term?
Well, whatever it takes, but clearly Afghanistan is not necessarily going to pay for it itself.
You will not build a strong army if you don't have a central government.
I agree.
Well, you know, look, I think the other problem is people don't like to be occupied. The Afghans don't want to be occupied. The Iraqis don't want to be occupied. A big part of the success, to the extent there was success in Iraq, came precisely when the Americans said, we're getting out of here. You Sunnis think that we want to stay, and you're fighting us because you want us out. No, we are getting out. And if you want to protect yourselves, then you have to get on our side and help us get out. That was absolutely critical to the strategy.
Do you think it was that or being squeezed between Al-Qaeda and the Shiites?
Well, the other thing that was going on is that Al-Qaeda made a lot of mistakes in Iraq and alienated that same population. So on the one hand, the people were learning to hate Al-Qaeda, and they thought, well, if we can help the Americans get out of here and they can build us up and support us, then we'll be stronger. And that's exactly what happened. Now, the political situation that exists there now is terrible. But I think we can say that in Iraq, there's probably always going to be a terrible political situation. But the occupation is ending. And that's important.
But Seamus, what Anna has argued is that, you know, the enemy or the occupier always leaves. And I think now they could just sit still and wait until they leave and take over afterwards.
A sensible and rational strategy from the Western point of view is to recognize that that's the case, to negotiate a withdrawal from the country with all the significant political and military forces in Afghanistan and guaranteed by the regional powers. And I think that's what's going to happen eventually. The problem is that a lot of political face is going to be lost in the intervening time, and a lot of blood is going to be shed unnecessarily to save that political face.
But this is exactly the deal, Colonel. I don't understand how the strongest military alliance in history, the NATO alliance, British forces, American forces, French, and almost close to 200,000 forces, including the private contractors, cannot win 10 years later against one of the least advanced forces one can see on the face of Earth.
I wouldn't disagree with you at all that a huge number of Western forces have not made huge progress, and it's partly by virtue of the type of campaign that's being fought.
But as I said earlier, it's getting worse. It's not getting any better. Now more British soldiers have died in Afghanistan than they did in Iraq, or let alone in the Falkland War.
And as I said earlier, we haven't yet seen the culmination of the US troop surge. And I think when we see that...
But as I said also, in the last 10 years, we've seen so many of these promises. Every time they come with a new name, fancy name of a new operation, but it also leads to more of the same deterioration.
But Richard, do you think from a military point of view that even with the maximum number of American soldiers that are being sent to, as part of the surge to Afghanistan, that it is possible to pacify the Pashtun areas, for example?
Well, as you know, it's extremely complicated. It's not just a question of one military force fighting another one. It's also a question of getting a government that's able to gain the confidence of the majority of people. That's
so
able to.
That's nowhere in play.
Nowhere in sight. No. But if we can get a government there that can win people across from supporting the insurgents into supporting that government, then I think we're on the way there.
Is that a real possibility?
Well, that's like, as the Mexicans say, if my aunt had wheels, she'd be a bicycle. I mean, it's a nonsense. We're not going to get a government like that. We can't make that government. We can't make it locally, and we can't make it nationally.
Because it would be a client government anyway.
Well, it would be a client government. It would be an occupation government, a quisling government in the vision of a lot of Afghans. And you look at these well-meaning Americans like Colonel Christmas, and you know, he's doing the best he can, but he doesn't know anything about Afghanistan, and he is totally alien in that environment. And anybody that they bring in from Kabul is also alien in that environment. And one thing you can almost guarantee is that most of the Taliban who are fighting around there are part of those families and part of that area. You are not going to win a war against people who are fighting on their home turf.
And there is another dimension. It's the regional dimension. American and Britain is allied with Pakistan in this fight in Afghanistan. And Pakistan has its own strategy, which has nothing to do with American or Western strategy. I mean, they look at Afghanistan in the context of their fight with India and with the question of Kashmir. They will never accept the American way of dealing in Afghanistan. And we have Iran also. Yeah. All these are important dimension of any solution in Afghanistan.
You know, actually, go ahead.
Well, and look at the way we're focusing this discussion. It's all on Marja, it's all down in south right now. One of the big risks is that the north, which has been relatively stable, relatively controlled, is starting to deteriorate. If you start to have the north going and have to start diverting troops there, which is already happening to some extent, you're really going to have a messy situation. And you start to have a classic guerrilla campaign that starts to move in on the capital. And I know people who are directly involved who are already concerned about that.
Seamus, the United States and Britain are very proud of their coalition. 5 Irish soldiers, 3 Austrian soldiers, along with the coalition. But we know for a fact that the Indians are involved, the Pakistanis are involved, the Iranians, the Saudis, also the Russians and the Chinese. Why not get engaged immediately the regional powers. Enough with the military arguments. Let's talk regional powers, getting involved in Afghanistan and trying to pacify it.
Well, that is the key to the settlement in the country, and has been for many years. And I'm convinced that's what will happen eventually. But
10 years later, absolutely no attempt at bringing those parties, except
they're
fighting a war in Pakistan.
There obviously is that process has begun, but it's very tentative, and the United States in particular is very resistant to it.
It's easy to sit here and say, get India and Pakistan to sit down and help out in Afghanistan. I mean, you know, that's not going to happen anytime soon.
Then you have to deal with the Kashmir question.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
So
we'll
it is a complicated situation.
We solve the Palestinian issue. I mean, it's
might as well. No, but seriously, how long would the NATO allies continue to walk in America's footsteps?
In Brussels, people at NATO will tell you the reason we're in Afghanistan is because it's the future of NATO. Because if we fail in Afghanistan, NATO fails.
This is the absolutely crucial point. That's what's taking place.
And it doesn't really have to do with Afghanistan.
Yeah, it's to do with the credibility of NATO and credibility of Western powers.
So let me ask once again, how many Afghans will need to die until the West gets its military act together?
Well, it won't get its military act together. There will, many more thousands will die for the sake of this credibility battle for NATO.
If the Taliban wanted to get the United States out of Afghanistan, all they would have to do is bring us the head of Osama bin Laden. And that would be it. There would be no support for staying there.
But you know very well, Chris, that now with Al-Qaeda spreading in Yemen, in Somalia,
with Al-Qaeda, with the Al-Qaeda franchises, all of which are ambitious for their own interests, all of which are pursuing their own agendas. This is not an international coherent movement, and it doesn't answer to Osama bin Laden. But if the United States wants to get out, and if people want us to get out, get rid of Osama and Ayman Zawahiri and yallah, we're out.
Your friend Mark Sageman, one of the leading terrorist experts in so-called terroristologists in America, actually told us in this program that there are no Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. Well, but having said that, we'll need to take a news break. Before we do, Flo Flips examines the merits of the most peddled moral justification for the war in Afghanistan, freedom for women.
Today, because we acted, Afghanistan's women serve as teachers and doctors and journalists and judges.
Tyranny has been replaced by a young democracy.
9 years into the war in Afghanistan, and the words of George and Laura Bush have a hollow ring. Any fig leaf of moral justification has been blown away.
Rape, pillage, plunder, the abduction of young girls, the threatening of school teachers, these recent incidents in terms of acid, all of these are results of increased militarization within society.
Once upon a time, Afghanistan seemed on the cusp of a normal life. But this cursed country has been plagued by war for decades, and women have always paid the price.
Times under the Taliban were undoubtedly tough, but the launching of a war and the launching of an occupation are tactics that are undoubtedly going to make the situation of Afghan women worse.
Operation Enduring Freedom, with its attempts to impose Western values, provided the Taliban with easy targets.
The attacks against women have gone up. Domestic violence has increased. The military occupation in Afghanistan has made has made the country more fundamentalist by legitimizing the Taliban opposition, and has made women suffer more.
The West has pushed education, but still illiteracy amongst women stands at a staggering 87%, and hundreds of schools have been torched. Today, over 70% of women are forced into arranged marriages, and the Western-backed Karzai government has only added to women's woes.
The trend for fundamentalism in this country, unfortunately, is in growth, and the main victim are women and children.
With no way out, Afghanistan has seen a sudden swell in female suicide attempts. In the past year alone, Herat City Hospital has treated more than 100 cases of self-immolation. In Kabul, there have been signs of progress, but old habits die hard.
15 months I was the Minister of Women's Affairs. For one time I was not called.
It seems that in Afghanistan, it's one step forward, 2 steps back.
The question isn't whether or not we should be supporting Afghan women. Of course, we all agree that we should. The question is whether or not the war has been a good means of doing that, and I think the answer to that is quite clearly no.
We're back with Colonel Richard Kemp, Alan Gresh from Le Monde Diplomatique, Newsweek editor Chris Dickey, and Seamus Milne from The Guardian newspaper. Gentlemen, as the US contemplates the withdrawal of its combat troops from Iraq this month, and presumably all by next year's end, many, including you, Seamus, doubt the seriousness of total withdrawal, calling it rebranding or outsourcing the occupation. All of which might explain why the likes of Iraqi Lieutenant General Zibari are preempting the withdrawal by voicing concern for the future of Iraq and the need for a decade-long US military presence, if not longer. Jackie Suen profiles one US military base in Iraq, Balad, which highlights why shipping out is easier presumed than executed.
We're going home! We won! It's over! America! We brought democracy to Iraq! I love you! I love you!
Late at night on August 18th, the U.S. Army's 4th Stryker Brigade crossed the border into Kuwait and publicly celebrated the official end of combat in Iraq. But with 50,000 combat-ready American troops still in country, the occupation seems far from over.
The Obama administration will insist that those are not combat soldiers engaged in a combat mission. But if you've got 20 or 30 or 40,000 foreign troops stationed on your soil, I mean, if it looks like an occupation and it smells like an occupation and it sounds like an occupation, it's an occupation.
The current status of forces agreement with Iraq requires a full U.S. withdrawal and an end to the occupation. And the U.S. military and State Department are busy planning for what they call an enduring presence after the treaty's deadline on December 31st, 2011. But on bases like this one in Balad, Iraq, the military continues to invest hundreds of millions in infrastructure improvements, and it is difficult to imagine them fully abandoning everything they are building here.
Joint Base Balad is approximately 10 square miles, which equates to about 6,500 acres. To put that in relative terms, Andrews Air Force Base, which is right outside D.C., is about 20% smaller than that. And we don't even have golf courses here, so that kind of puts it in perspective of how big that is. We have about 28,000 people who call Joint Base Balad home. This is the rec center on the backside of these T-walls.
U.S. Air Force Colonel Sal NODJOMIAN takes us on a tour of what is essentially a small American city, complete with 3 large gyms, multiple shopping centers, recreation areas, and a movie theater. In 2003, military planners expected to keep Balad as a long-term airbase. While smaller U.S. outposts are closing down around the country, Balad keeps expanding, and some in the military still believe that the U.S. Air Force will remain here past the 2012 deadline.
Our senior leadership is studying options to draw down our presence here in Iraq. Joint Base Balad is one of the bases that's often talked about as one of the more semi-permanent or strategic overwatch bases.
We've had Air Force bases in the United Kingdom for the last half-century. They're not called U.S. Air Force bases. They're called Royal Air Force bases, but they're owned lock, stock, and barrel by the United States Air Force. So there are ways to work around what might seem like an airtight commitment.
If an agreement is reached and the Iraqis ask us to stay or invite us to stay in whatever capacity, whether it's a training capacity or a co-located capacity, then that's something that can be, that'll be decided.
It remains to be seen whether conventional U.S. forces will stay in some of these massive bases, but there are some troops who definitely plan to be here after the withdrawal deadline. 4,500 members of elite special operations forces will train Iraqis and cooperate on counterterrorism missions.
We have advisors that work with the whole chain of incentive.
Brigadier General SIMEON TROMBITAS shows us a training exercise of Iraq's counterterrorism force that his men train and work with. He says that they spend most of their days side by side with Iraqi officers.
Throughout the world and in this region, special forces are, we're special because we do maintain a relationship with foreign forces. There'll be a working relationship for a while.
The United States is going to continue to train Iraqi Special Operations Forces. What this essentially amounts to is an Iraqization of the U.S. occupation.
We maintain that relationship so we impart our values and maintain those values. And the longer we work together, the more alike we are.
What this means is that the United States can say, we don't have a military occupation in Iraq, while at the same time having U.S. military forces effectively directing forces that are masquerading as indigenous, but in reality amount to basic proxy forces for the United States.
In addition to several thousand Special Operations Forces and an unknown number of Air Force personnel, the U.S. State Department has announced that it will hire an army of as many as 7,000 mercenaries to be deployed on 5 enduring presence posts across Iraq.
Yes, a lot of U.S. military forces are going to be leaving the country, but what we're seeing happen right now, the U.S. State Department is beginning a militarization of its operations in Iraq, a downsizing and a rebranding of the U.S. occupation.
Well, Colonel Kemp, you've heard Colonel BACEVICH. If it looks like a duck, if it walks like a duck, if it quacks like a duck, it's an occupation. So that's it. You're going to be occupying Iraq for how many more years to come?
Well, personally, I'm not going to be, but I agree. We're planning to leave, well, the Americans are planning to leave 50,000 troops there for at least the next year, and almost certainly well beyond that. So of course, it's it's a huge presence, and they will undoubtedly be required to support the Iraqi military in the problems that they won't be able to deal with themselves.
But at the same time, I mean, United States is a fading power in Iraq. I mean, there have been elections 6 months ago, and there is no government. And the political parties, the Iraqi political parties, don't go to discuss their problem to Turkey, to Iran, to Syria, not to United States. You know, you said the same thing, which was very important. We made the Afghan war in 2001 and 2002, and then after, the American leadership looked to Iraq. I don't think the American leadership is able to make 2 wars at the same time. And now, it's an occupation in some way, but it's not an occupation in the sense they are able to shape the political landscape in Iraq.
That's right. I don't think a presence, an enduring presence, is the same as an occupation. And really who it depends on is the Iraqis themselves. Do they see it as an occupation? When the Americans had troops in Saudi Arabia, you never saw those troops anywhere, but somehow it got ginned up in the mind of the Saudis that this was an occupation, and bin Laden and others capitalized on that. Whether under these circumstances the Iraqis see a place like Balad, this base that really is in the middle of nowhere, whether they see that as an occupation or just a military presence is, I think, an open question. And I think
but that's a misleading comparison, Christopher. The idea that there were deployment of American forces in Saudi Arabia is one thing, but to occupy a country like Iraq led to the killing of several hundred thousands of people,
well,
destroying the infrastructure of the country,
let us see what
and
the
then leave
Iraqi
bases.
response
That's
is.
not an occupation?
Let us see what the Iraqi response is. You get the Americans off the streets. You get them at a base like Balad. You have them pulled back and just bringing in logistical supplies and doing training mainly on that base. And I think most Iraqis are going to say, fine, goodbye. We don't really care. Just don't interfere in our crazy, complicated, not very effective political life or anything else. The question will arise if there is an eruption of new internecine conflicts in Iraq, if there is a new Sunni-Shia civil war, if any of that develops, and you then have the Americans coming out of those bases and intervening directly, then that starts to look like an occupation. It all becomes very complicated again. But my guess is they'll just close the door.
Is the Colonel and Mr. Dickey here underestimating the idea of a tens of thousands of troops presence in Iraq after the war?
Clearly, I mean, the occupation is being rebranded. I mean, they're giving it new names. Combat operations are going to be called stability operations, and as the main US military spokesman in Iraq said, nothing will change in any way whatsoever after the end of this month. And a large part of the occupation will be and is being outsourced to private security contractors, and that process is being expanded. And I think that's the sort of the modern form, the emerging modern form of Western occupation. But I think I slightly take issue with the argument of Alain and Chris, because I think the strategic grip of the United States on Iraq is being maintained and is profound, in the sense that if the United States forces really did withdraw from Iraq and all the military power was excluded from the country, this government would fall immediately. This political process would fall because these are forces that are associated with the occupation from the beginning. These political forces in Baghdad are not sufficiently autonomous to survive.
Maybe not now, Seamus, but what about a few years ago? I mean,
What is clear, Iraq is not anymore a country. This is a problem. I mean, the American and British intervention has destroyed the country, destroyed the state, destroyed the society, killed 100,000 people perhaps, and create the condition for having Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And Iraq will not play in the 10 or 20 next years any important regional role as a state. This is the reality.
It certainly won't have a free will to
act.
It's
not an independent country.
Well, but I think there's a factor here that you have to take into account. If you look at Germany, for instance, a hostile power that was occupied by the Allies after the war and where bases remained for decades and decades, what was it that made that possible? Fear. Fear of the Russians, fear of the Soviet Union. That's why you could keep an American military presence in Germany. And I don't think you can discount the role of fear in Iraq. And the fear is directed at Iran. Iraq knows it is helpless right now. It knows it has no army. As big as that army is absolutely incapable of defending it from any neighbor except possibly Kuwait.
But once again, you create the conditions.
Yes,
so
that's true, but it's a question.
You destroy the state, you destroy its army.
I don't disagree with anything that Allah said. You've known me for a long time, Marwan. You know I thought the war was a stupid idea, a disastrous idea, and the disaster followed, and all the disasters that he laid out were absolutely true. But the question is, what happens now? If it were up to me, if it were up to me, I would say get all the Americans out. But it's not up to me. And if they're going to stay, then I think in analyzing that situation, you have to look at it a little bit more carefully than just saying it's rebranding the occupation.
Well, the idea that when the occupation is downscaled and outsourced more, and American troops are off the streets, which they've been off the streets in most parts of Iraq for quite a while anyway, that somehow Iraq is going to say, fine, that's we'll accept that. I don't think that's realistic at all.
Colonel, is this another case like in Afghanistan, in Iraq, a case of you simply cannot win really in the end of the day, and you cannot withdraw in the end of the day?
I think it's a very serious situation. I think that in the long term there will be a need for US forces to remain in the region, and almost certainly in Iraq itself, in order to intervene if it gets too difficult for the Iraqi forces to deal with.
You would think that now that war has proved that it's incapable as an instrument to impose Western will in the region, that they would withdraw or not engage in more wars. But in fact, what they're doing is reinventing new tools of war, new toys, if you will, deadly ones, like the Predators. And here's one report, and we'll try to discuss the future of war right after it.
This is Titan 1-4. No signs of life.
The theory is to take down the bad guys quickly and cleanly.
Unmanned aircraft is identifying enemy sniper. Copy that. Let's move.
Dispensing death without casualties. For the Americans. The reality on the ground is a whole lot messier. UAVs, or unmanned aerial vehicles, are a military strategist's dream. They cover vast areas over inhospitable terrain.
Sentinel pilot, I've got 8 missiles.
All controlled from the distant comfort and safety of a padded chair in the USA.
Because of the technology, we have these greater expectations that somehow we should be able to do war in a clean manner, because we're not going into harm's way, so of course it should also be clean on the other side. But that's not the reality of it.
I don't believe there can be really such a thing as risk-free war. I mean, at the best, you're going to risk-free war for one nation.
Drones have transformed the way the US military does business, targeting Al-Qaeda and Taliban leaders from as far afield as Iraq, Somalia, and Yemen. These attacks over sovereign airspace raise serious questions, though, about what are effectively targeted assassinations.
The onus is really on the government of the United States to reveal more about the ways in which it makes sure that arbitrary executions, extrajudicial executions, are not in fact being carried out through the use of these weapons.
Around 1,000 people have been killed in these attacks so far. The Pakistanis are claiming that most of the victims were innocent civilians, and each death is a propaganda triumph for the Taliban.
When they're used with great discrimination and great precision, they can be very useful. But when they're not, they can be very destructive to our own goal.
But is it merely a question of hit or miss? Or is it a revolution in military strategy that will dramatically transform war as we know it?
Colonel, this seems to be more and more the weapons of choice now in Afghanistan and in the region in general. You've been used in Somalia and Yemen. The Israelis tried this before. They withdrew from Lebanon, they withdrew from Gaza. They tried this firing from far. It didn't work out. They ended up back occupying and attacking, invading South Lebanon and Gaza. Is this the way forward now, from now on, for the British and American forces, for the NATO allies?
If we need to target these developments around the world, whether it's in Yemen, whether it's in Somalia, whether it's in the Maghreb, whether it is in Afghanistan or Pakistan, then the ideal way of doing it clearly is to enable the local forces, or help enable the local forces to tackle the problem themselves. And Britain and America and other nations are actively doing that in the countries that are of greatest concern.
So you're against the use of drones?
And the next thing to back that up is the use of drones. It is the use of drones, but drones are no more going to be completely effective against insurgents on the ground or terrorists on the ground, however you want to describe them, than aerial bombing has ever been effective in any war. It's a weapon system. It's something that's proved very effective in targeting the leadership, for example, of Al-Qaeda in Pakistan. Extremely effective, and Al-Qaeda is to an extent reeling as a result of it.
It's very tricky too, because I mean, where do we think we get the intelligence to target those people on the ground? We have to depend on who? Local actors to do that. And who are they? We have to depend on the Pakistani intelligence services to tell us who to kill. Now, when they give us the right targets, we kill the right targets. When they give us the wrong targets, we kill the wrong targets. But what's interesting is to hear this claim that the Pakistanis are opposed to these raids. Hell no. These raids are very often serving the interests of the Pakistani government, and everybody knows that.
But of course the Pakistani government faces both ways on the issues, but it's
publicly
denounced them and said exactly what was said on the package, namely that the majority of people killed are civilians. But on the other hand, it's also collaborating with them and allowing the drones to take off from Pakistan.
Has there been on the Pakistani government over the last years
over this
under
issue?
The AFPAC strategy, and why Afghanistan now government being almost bought out?
If you want to look at the real politics of Afghanistan, I think none of this issue is going to compare even remotely to the floods that are devastating Pakistan right now, an issue in which the United States is being more helpful than everybody else, but not nearly helpful enough. If you want to make a difference, then you address the needs of a country in distress the way it is right now in the flooding.
With this militarization, Alain, and especially the whole idea of this counterterrorism, I mean, what is it exactly? What is counterterrorism? A lot of people claim it's terrorism on mass scale.
Yes, it's killing individuals in principle. In general, it's not against insurrection. It's against leader of what we call terrorist group. But first, it's not effective because we are dependent on our ally on the ground, and it creates hostility to the Western country. We should understand something. We are not in the age of empire. Empire are finished, and people don't like to be governed by others. If you take the example of Iraq, it's very interesting because most of the population was against Saddam Hussein. At the same time, they are not happy with Americans. And this is one of the lessons of the 20th century.
But they are supporting the idea of intervention, the legitimacy of intervention throughout, in this case, the Muslim world. All the countries that Marwan was talking about are all Muslim countries.
Well, it's about
and we've seen the war on terror.
I mean,
we've seen the war on terror be rebranded as international contingency operations, and it's actually spreading under this administration. I mean, into places like Yemen.
In fact, the report about America intensifying its secret covert operations, intelligence gathering and so on in the Muslim world has been proved, it's been reported, it's out there. And that, with enduring presence in Iraq, military presence with tens of thousands, escalating the war in Afghanistan, threatening Iran, engaging in countries like Yemen and Somalia, where do you think that's going to take the United States and the greater Middle East?
Not toward empire. The only way you can sell any of this domestically in the United States is as a defensive posture. When George Bush was telling the American people, we're going to Afghanistan and we're going to Iraq because we want to fight them there so we don't have to fight them here, his message was very simple. Not we're going to go out and change the world, we're going to go out and keep the world from changing us. When he started to talk about democratization, we're going to spread democracy all over, his polls went through the floor. That was it. Nobody in America, we have no mission to civilize like the French. We don't care about changing the world. We just care about not having the world change us. So what Obama is trying to do is precisely that. He's not trying, he may talk about democracy, he may talk about all those kinds of issues, but what he's really pushing is still the line, we just want to do what we have to do to keep people from attacking us.
The idea of a clash of civilization and clash of religion in the Western world. What we see now is the question of the mosque in New York, and what we see in France, etc., is the idea that the Muslims are enemies. They are enemies in Iraq, in Afghanistan, but they are now enemies inside our countries. And this is a very, very dangerous trend.
Well, on this sober note, Seamus, gentlemen, Colonel, we're going to have to wrap it up, and I'll be back with a final thought. The U.S. fiasco in Iraq and Afghanistan has exposed the limits of superpowers' military capacity to win wars, let alone hearts and minds in faraway lands. Instead, Western wars in Eastern lands have spread chaos and exposed its weaknesses. And yet, in addition to hundreds of military bases in Iraq and Afghanistan, the U.S. military continues to deploy its forces in more than 100,000 structures, in over 700 bases, in more than 100 countries around the world. Indeed, for decades, Washington has further redeployed, not withdrawn, its forces from the world. The U.S. president is said to be committed to withdrawing U.S. forces from Iraq and reducing them in Afghanistan by the end of next year. And most Americans agree and want their country to mind its own business. Call me idealistic, but I still think that in a democracy, the people have the last word. Besides, what would happen if, for a start, the U.S. closes down, say, half of its overseas military bases, downsizes its empire, and goes home? Think about it. If you have any more thoughts on the subject, please write to me at empire@aljazeera.net. And thank you for watching.